All right. Welcome, everybody, to For the Love of Language, where linguists talk all things language. We are super excited. Today, we're going to talk about semantics and pragmatics. What are they? What is the difference? Why does it matter?
Let's find out.
All right. So let's start out with just like a couple of really basic definitions. Like,
Yeah.
what is semantics? You'll hear pretty frequently in conversations, someone will like be like, that's not what that technically means. And then someone will retort, just semantics.
hmm
But just semantics is like kind of blowing aside the fundamental meaning of words in language. So how would you define semantics, Stacie?
Yeah. So like you said, there's a very like colloquial way that we refer to semantics. That's just like an alternative meaning or an alternative interpretation, right? That's like the very colloquial way to describe it. In linguistics, semantics has a little bit of a different meaning, a little bit of a different take. Now, granted, I'm going to be straight up, I'm not a semanticist, and I'm sure semanticists out there will correct me. So, taking this with a grain of salt, I'm still learning myself because semantics is actually a little bit more complicated. Semantics and semanticists use formal logic to talk about the meaning of like words and ideas. Now that seems like a pretty general, like that seems obvious, right? Semantics and meaning, but it's not always like what you think it is, right? Like it's meaning relative to context. And that context is like a bunch of other pure meanings. Now, what's really tricky is like the semantics versus pragmatics and where do you like draw the line of what is pragmatics and what is just pure essential meaning that can be described with formal logic. And that's where semanticists kind of come in and try to make those separations.
Mhm.
Yeah, I feel like if we were in a visual medium where I could draw on a whiteboard, I might be able to explain it a little bit better. But that's like the general idea so far, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the way that I was, taught it about it in my linguistics courses was that semantics is really the meanings, the definitions of words versus pragmatics is when you have meaning from the context, like using the context to, I guess, modify or more fully understand the actual intent of a phrase versus semantics is more of the like this is the logic, the meaning, the definition. Like you definitely have collocates and phrases and that will change the meaning of a sentence, but then pragmatics is when you say like, this is the society and the culture and everything around this statement that is actually impacting the meaning of what's being said. So maybe if we could give a couple examples of
Yeah.
where a single phrase might have like a certain meaning, but then given the pragmatics, what it actually means is something totally different.
Yeah. Really good, really good. And I will just to kind of like bounce off of what you said because I liked your redefinition and clarification. Context is a little bit different in like semantics and pragmatics. Pragmatics is not the context. Pragmatics is stuff on top of context. Context itself is like what did the person say previously? What is the conversation like? What is like the main topic of the conversation about? That's like immediate context. And also context being like the world in which we live or the world that we're like imagining is happening, right? That's like the context.
Right. So you're saying that like with semantics, we're talking about the context of like, here's this word, where is it in the phrase, what's surrounding it, versus with pragmatics, the context is more like the society, the cultural norms, things like that.
So I think, like you said, a good way to explain this would probably be via an example. And I think a pretty decent example, and semanticists might get after me for this, but I think it's a pretty good example, is like idioms, right? And we can have a whole other episode about like idioms and stuff. But take, for example, it's raining cats and dogs, right? The pure semantic meaning of it would be something like, in the world there exists cats and there exists something called dogs. Now what those things are is relative to our understanding of what makes a cat and a dog. And in this world in which there are cats and dogs, there is this concept called rain. And raining is something of, it's to like come down. It's to, for usually like a liquid to come from the sky or whatever, right? There is a showering of sorts, and these cats and these dogs in this world happen to be falling down. That would be like the semantics behind it, right? The pure meaning and understanding of what's going on. The pragmatics, on the other hand, is okay, but like okay, so in this world there are cats and dogs that are falling from the sky, essentially. But we understand that that is like an idiom, and within like our culture, that doesn't necessarily mean that there are actual cats and dogs falling from the sky. That means that it's raining very hard, right? And so that's more of the pragmatics. That's more of the, well, with given what we know about what's possible in our world, and given how our world has kind of decided to interpret things, when you say it's raining cats and dogs, you don't really mean that it's actually raining cats and dogs. We're using that to talk about how it's just raining really heavily.
Definitely. Yeah, I think idioms are a really good example of this. Like you have all sorts of idioms. Like people say, oh yeah, so and so kicked the bucket. They're not actually kicking a physical bucket. It's an
Yeah.
idiom to say that someone passed away or died.
Yes. But the semantics behind it are that there is a world in which a person exists, and they kicked something that in this world is described to be a bucket, right?
Right.
That's more what the semanticists do.
Right. The semantics is more the literal meaning, the definitions put together. I think, even outside of idioms though, like take a phrase like I love you. If
Yeah.
you have, you know, maybe just a conversation between friends and someone does something hilarious and someone's like, "Oh my God, I love you." That's gonna mean something totally different than if you have, two people who've been on a couple dates and they've never said I love you before, and they're actually expressing more of a romantic care and long-term interest for each other. So
Yeah.
like the same phrase, I love you, can actually have drastically different meanings depending on that context.
Yeah. So oftentimes, colloquially, when people say, it's just semantics, they often mean it's often pragmatics. Like, that's just another way that the word could be used. But of course, the way we use words colloquially, it changes. But maybe to give you an example of things that semanticists work on, I can tell you about the project that I did for my semantics class. And I didn't come up with anything good from it, but the idea behind it, the question is really interesting. So, as many of us well know, things in the world are changing in terms of how gender is perceived, right? And there's new and different ways to talk about gender, specifically like non-binary gender and the use of they, them as a singular pronoun. And with this new change coming about, a lot of semanticists, like a good chunk of semanticists, I'm not going to lie, have been examining and thinking about if the actual semantics of the word of they, them as a pronoun have been changing, or if it's just the pragmatics, like the practical use of they, them has been changing. Right. And so my project was essentially like, okay, what are people's ideas of how this might be changing semantically, if it's being changed semantically, or if it's or if it's like maintained its stability semantically, and that's why it's become such a versatile pronoun. And then the pragmatics have just kind of expanded. And so because of the like bare naked nature of the semantics of they, them, that's why it's been able to like take on a greater pragmatic load in being a pronoun for non-binary people, or other people who, just choose to identify using they, them. So it was actually really fascinating. Semanticists will look at stuff kind of like that, just to give a broad example of what a semanticist might look at or do.
Right. I think that's a great example because, like, we know that historically they, them has been used as a singular pronoun for centuries. Like, no one who knows anything about the history of the word actually questions that. But, like, the question here is, was it being used like deliberately to indicate a non-binary gender, or was it just being used to indicate like we don't actually know who this person is? Like there's different semantic questions that can go into that, and like what was actually included in the meaning. And you'll find also that different individuals are going to interpret words also in different ways. Like you have the language, you have the dialects across a region or a group, and then you have the idiolects that's like, this is how I speak. And so there's like lots of layers and complexity that can definitely go into that.
Yeah, it was really interesting when I was looking into this project. I wanted to just see what people's inherent perceptions were of the pronoun they, them. And I specifically wanted to ask people in the queer community and people who identified as non-binary how they kind of like interpreted their use of they, them, where if they, them indicated a third gender, which was non-binary, or if it indicated an absence or lack of gender. Because some semanticists hypothesize that it is the lack of a gender feature on the pronoun. So like him and her are like have this sort of gender attached to them, whereas they has been kind of like naked in gender. And that's why I say it's bare naked, because it doesn't have a gender feature.
I like it. I like
it's
it.
Saucy. It's like, it keeps it a little saucy. And so they hypothesize that that's kind of why they, them has been able to take on this role, because it has an absence of gender. So my idea was like, oh, in as time has been going on, has it been adopting a gendered like feature that is specifically for like non-binary people, i.e. a third gender, or is it maintaining its nakedness? And I kind of wanted to poll people and see what they thought. And of course it varied. Right. Of course it varied a little bit. Most people identified it as being like a third gender thing. So semantically speaking, the consensus is that it still has an absence of a gender feature. However, I think personally, this is just a Stacie hot take for a second, that it might adopt a gendered feature, and we might have two different they, thems, with one specifically for like plurality, and or maybe three, one specifically for plurality, one specifically for singularity without any gender, and then one that does have gender. Now this might not be the case, but it could theoretically happen.
Oh, I think that is happening right now, just based on my own anecdotal evidence as well.
Yeah.
It's super fascinating.
Yeah. So it is kind of an interesting thing. And again, I wasn't able to say anything like super insightful or helpful to the semantic community in this idea. I kind of just explained what this phenomenon was like. But again, that's something that the semanticists are looking for. So, and that's another thing about semantics, pardon me, is that it cuts through things like homonyms, right? If a word sounds the same or looks the same, semantics is able to cut through that and be like, actually, just because it looks the same or sounds the same, or it might even be the same pronoun, for God's sake, it can be semantically very different. And there might be multiple mappings, multiple like phonetic, phonological, morphological mappings to a meaning.
Definitely. Yeah, I love that. And I think they, them is a great example of that. I think there's been other meanings that have changed recently in like words related to the pandemic.
Yeah.
We have this concept of social distancing, which is, a phrase rather than a word, but it has meanings
Mm-hmm.
attached to it now that are different than it would have been, 3 or 4 years ago. And that's a semantic thing, that the meaning of that phrase has actually changed over time. I think, if you go down into the pragmatics side of things, then things that you start looking at more, as opposed to just definitions and meanings, you start looking more at implications,
Mm-hmm.
connotations. Like, you might sometimes colloquially refer to it as reading between the lines, like
Yeah.
understanding what's actually being said.
Yeah, things like idioms, things like tone of voice, things like turn taking and interrupting. That all kind of falls under the big umbrella of pragmatics. Pragmatics
Mhm.
essentially being just like when, where, how, why you use language in the first place.
Definitely. I had a professor who was really, really focused on studying implications.
Mm,
And so he had like mapped out and diagrammed, what are the different ways that we create implications. So, for instance, you might have something like someone is speaking and they say, I didn't like it when you spoke to my dog or something. I'm just pulling something out of the air.
yeah.
And then you're not directly saying you spoke to my dog, but because it's in that when clause, it's implied that this did in fact happen.
Yeah.
So you'll have these interesting ways that language is used that way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm not going to lie, pragmatics is a little bit understated in the like purely scientific world of linguistics because it is a lot of like sociological, psychological, it's all of that fluff stuff, right? It's not necessarily like it's like culturally relative and it's going to vary from person to person, culture to culture, and it's not that it doesn't get to that core question that a lot of linguists are looking for is to like how and why does language work in our minds and our brains universally, because pragmatics is not universal. Pragmatics is like the biggest variant. It probably is like the all of the variations within language itself, and that's what a lot of people are interested in. So things like idioms and all this other like fluffy stuff on top of it, that's all the stuff that we're really interested in. Those are all the like the variations and the differences, but it's something that's not talked a lot about in like formal linguistics because we're not interested in all of the little nuances and variation. We're trying to look at the universals.
Well, I think there are people who are very, very interested and dive
You're
into
correct. You're
specific
correct.
languages and nuances. I think
I'm not saying that
you
those
lean
people don't
towards the
exist.
universals, and I
Yes.
think there is a group of people that lean towards the universals, but there's
Yes.
also like a group of people that don't believe in language universals, right? Like
Yeah.
there is a full spectrum even within the linguistics
Yeah,
community.
I'm not saying they're not there. They're just understated. They're not the big names like Mr. Chomsky or whatever, right? They're because they're the ones who make like people like Noam Chomsky and others that I just don't want to name right now because I could name drop for ages.
Oh, we'll have to do a whole episode on
Well,
Chomsky at some point.
we will. I actually listened to a lecture on. I actually listened to a lecture he gave recently. He's still very much alive, everybody. He's still very much alive and giving lectures. And I attended one of his lectures recently, and it was absolutely fascinating. Some of the ideas that he has about language. But anyway, so what I'm saying is, a lot of people who do focus on like pragmatics and stuff, they're not like as well recognized or as they're just not as popular unfortunately as some of the other more universalist like UG type people, but like they're definitely out there.
Universal grammar is what
Yes,
UG is
universal
for
grammar,
those
my
who aren't
apologies.
familiar.
Yes, so what I'm saying is that it's a little unfortunate because it is a very interesting side of linguistics.
Definitely. Is there anything else that you would just kind of call out in highlighting the differences between semantics and pragmatics. This has been a little bit of a different episode, just kind of diving into a couple of the more, technical aspects of linguistics.
Yeah, more of a definitions episode, which I think are like sometimes you need clarification about definitions. They're hard. They're hard even within linguistics to understand some of these things. I would just say about semantics and pragmatics. Pragmatics is everywhere, and it's not something that you can avoid. And as a linguist, I think it's something that linguists should be more aware of and should call out more in like formal studies and experiments and stuff, because pragmatics can definitely like influence your data in ways that you might not expect.
Definitely.
So, like, I guess I'm just highlighting again how understated I think pragmatics is, and how us formal linguists should really consider it more.
Yeah, no, I loved learning about pragmatics in college. I think it's, personally, I think it's way more fascinating than just pure semantics, because there's so much to, pragmatics, and how the context and the person speaking and the location, like everything impacts the actual meaning of what's being said. Like, a huge one that we didn't touch on actually is sarcasm. Like,
Oh,
you can
yeah.
say something that semantically means one thing, but because of this thing we call sarcasm, you're actually saying the exact opposite. And like, that's very much a pragmatics thing rather than a
Yeah.
semantics thing.
Yeah, absolutely. As indicated through prosody of all things.
Mm.
That's what's really interesting about pragmatics too, is pragmatics interfaces with all aspects of language. It works with the syntax, it works with the semantics, it works with the morphology, it works with the phonology and the phonetics. It goes through everything. It cuts through all of it. And so that's why I'm saying, like, every step of the way it should be considered, because it's there through everything. And sarcasm is a huge example of that, where you're not changing anything except for how you're saying it, like how, like the inflection in your voice, and maybe like raising your eyebrows or giving a little side eye, right? That's it. And all of a sudden the meaning is completely different.
Definitely. Cool. Well, let's call that for our episode on semantics versus pragmatics. Let us know if you have any questions. Follow us on Instagram at For the Love of Language. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions, and any ideas you have for future episodes as well. So see y'all later.
Thank y'all.